What would you do if the quiet rhythm of your life was shattered by something so senseless, so infuriating, that it made your blood boil? That was the question I found myself asking on a crisp autumn morning when I realized something was wrong, terribly wrong. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't belong on a farm. The birds were chirping, the breeze rustled through the trees, but something was missing. The sound of hooves crunching through the leaves. Every morning, without fail, Willow, the white-tailed deer that had practically become family, would be there near the feeding station, waiting, watching. But today, nothing. I called her name, even whistled. She always came. Always. A wild animal by nature, but a creature of habit all the same. My gut twisted as I pulled out my phone and opened the tracking app. Last fall, I'd fitted Willow with a state-funded GPS collar, part of a conservation program monitoring local deer populations. The tracker showed her still on my land, near the creek at the back of my property. But she wasn't moving. Deer don't stay still for that long. Not unless something's very wrong. A sick feeling settled in my stomach as I grabbed my jacket and headed toward the woods. My boots crunched against the damp grass as I walked, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Had she been injured? Caught in a poacher's snare? Or, God forbid, had some idiot from Oak Ridge Estates ignored the property lines and taken a shot at her? The subdivision had been a thorn in my side for years. A soulless cluster of identical beige houses that popped up a decade ago, encroaching on land that should have been left wild. And ruling over it all was Karen Whitmore, the power-hungry HOA president who treated every minor inconvenience like a personal crusade. The closer I got to the creek, the heavier the dread sat in my chest. Then I saw it. A mound of freshly dug dirt. I stopped cold. The ground was disturbed, uneven, like something had been buried there. My pulse hammered as I dropped to my knees and started clawing at the soil. The first thing I found was the GPS collar, the strap cut clean through. Then, just beneath the surface, blood-soaked leaves. A red haze clouded my vision. I clenched my fists around the broken collar, my breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Willow was gone. And this wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. This was personal. Whoever did this thought they could hide it. Thought they could get away with it. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I stormed back to my house, my mind locked in a cycle of rage and disbelief. Willow was gone, buried like trash at the edge of my land, and I already had a damn good idea of who was responsible. My hands shook as I yanked open my laptop and clicked straight into the Oak Ridge Estates HOA Facebook group, a cesspool of self-important rule enforcers, passive-aggressive complaints about mailbox colors, and people who thought wielding power over a homeowners association made them something special. And there it was. A post, time-stamped last night. Karen Whitmore, her blonde bob as stiff as the expression on her face, stood next to Willow's antlers. A hunting rifle in one manicured hand, her nails painted some god-awful shade of red. The caption read, "Trophy hunting in my own backyard. Sorry, Bambi. Survival of the fittest. Nail polish." My chair scraped against the floor as I shot up, fists curling at my sides. She had no idea what she had just done. This wasn't just any deer. Willow wasn't some nameless animal roaming the woods, she was a research subject. A protected one. And now, thanks to Karen's insatiable need to prove she was queen of her little suburban kingdom, she had committed a crime far worse than just trespassing or poaching out of season. I grabbed Willow's cut GPS collar and my truck keys. If Karen thought she could sweep this under the rug, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The HOA held their weekly meeting at the community clubhouse, a soulless beige building sitting at the heart of Oak Ridge Estates, where residents gathered to hear Karen's latest list of ridiculous demands. No holiday decorations past January 2nd. No mailboxes that weren't HOA approved. No dogs over 20 pounds. And now, apparently, no protected wildlife. I shoved open the doors, and the room fell silent. A sea of pastel-colored sweaters, pearl necklaces, and beer-gutted retirees all turned to stare. At the head of the table, perched like a damn queen on her throne, was Karen. Her expression barely flickered before settling back into her usual smugness. I didn't waste time. I strode to the front and tossed Willow's GPS collar onto the table. "Explain this." Karen blinked, then wrinkled her nose like I'd just thrown roadkill at her. She barely glanced at the collar. "I have no idea what that is," she said, adjusting her sweater like this was some kind of minor inconvenience instead of a felony staring her in the face. My jaw tightened. "That's the tracking collar from the deer you killed." My voice was sharp, cutting through the tense silence. "The deer you buried in my woods. The deer that was part of a state wildlife conservation program." A murmur rippled through the room. Even the die-hard HOA loyalists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen sighed dramatically, flipping her hair over one shoulder. "Oh, please. It was a deer. They're practically pests. If anything, I did you a favor." I saw red. "A favor?" My voice came out rough, barely controlled. "You poached a protected animal." I took a step closer, making sure she could see just how serious this was. "That deer had a GPS tracker on it. Do you even understand what that means? The state is going to see exactly where she was last before she died. And guess whose backyard that is?" Karen's smirk faltered, just for a second. It was quick, but I saw it. A crack in the armor. She crossed her arms. "The state isn't going to do anything." Her voice was still arrogant, but there was something new creeping in, uncertainty. "It was on my property, and I don't see a problem with hunting a nuisance." I let out a slow, humorless laugh. "Well, let's test that theory, shall we?" I pulled out my phone, my finger hovering over the send button. One tap, and the game warden would have everything: GPS data, screenshots of Karen's smug little Facebook post, even pictures of the disturbed ground where I'd found Willow's collar. I looked Karen in the eye and pressed send. Karen's face paled. A few of her HOA cronies glanced at each other, realizing this was bigger than their usual petty fines and complaints about lawn height. Even the ones who usually worshipped Karen's every word started shifting in their seats. She forced a laugh, but it came out thin, forced. "You're being ridiculous. It's not like I shot someone's pet dog." I took a slow step closer, my voice dropping to something only she could hear. She was more than just a deer. The room had gone silent. Even the people who hated my guts, the ones who had reported me for leaving my tractor in view, for having a fence that wasn't aesthetic enough, weren't backing Karen up now. Finally, Karen scoffed, grabbed her purse, and stood. "Whatever. This meeting is over." She turned to leave, but I stepped into her path, voice low and sharp. "Oh no, Karen." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "This is just getting started." Karen stormed out of the meeting, her perfect bob bouncing with each furious step, but I wasn't fooled. She could act like this was nothing, like I was just some crazy farmer with a grudge, but I'd seen the flicker of panic in her eyes when I pressed send. She knew she was in trouble. And I knew that when people like Karen felt the walls closing in, they didn't admit defeat. They doubled down. I didn't have to wait long for her next move. Less than an hour after she left the meeting, my phone lit up with notifications from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA Facebook group. Karen was already in full-on damage control mode, spinning the story like she always did. According to her new version of events, Willow had been aggressive, a dangerous animal terrorizing the neighborhood. She claimed she had no idea the deer was part of some research program and that she had only acted to protect the community. It charged at neighborhood pets. It scared children. I had no choice but to take action. The safety of Oak Ridge Estates always comes first. I nearly choked on my coffee. Willow, aggressive. That deer was about as dangerous as a golden retriever with a head cold. Anyone who had ever seen her knew Karen was lying through her bleached veneers. But Karen had power. And power made people stupidly loyal. A few of her usual lapdogs jumped in to defend her. Karen has always looked out for this community. Wild animals have no place near a residential neighborhood. Why is this man so obsessed with a deer? For a second, I felt my stomach turn. People were actually buying it. But then, something unexpected happened. People started pushing back. Neighbors I never expected to speak up were suddenly commenting, calling Karen out. I live near the creek. That deer was always calm. My kids loved seeing her. Karen, didn't you say the same thing about the stray cats last year? That they were dangerous before you had animal control take them away? Oh, please. This isn't about safety. She just hates anything that isn't under her control. And then the floodgates opened. Post after post, comment after comment, people started talking. About the fines. About the ridiculous HOA rules Karen had forced on them. About the bullying, the intimidation, the hypocrisy. She fined me $200 because my mailbox wasn't the exact shade of beige on the HOA approved list. She had my son's lemonade stand shut down for violating commercial zoning laws. He's 7. She had my magnolia tree cut down because she didn't like that it blocked her view. And then came the one that stopped me cold. A woman named Sandra Mitchell posted something that made my stomach drop. Karen once threatened me with a fine for feeding stray cats. She told me if I wanted to live with animals, I should buy a farm like that, outside the HOA. My grip on my phone tightened. That outside the HOA? She was talking about me. Karen had been gunning for me long before Willow. I leaned back in my chair, watching as Karen's once loyal followers started turning on her. She had spent years ruling this neighborhood like a dictator, using fear, fines, and HOA regulations to get her way. But the cracks in her empire were starting to show. And then came the final, glorious nail in the coffin. Someone, I had a very strong suspicion about who, tipped off the media. By the next morning, a news van was parked at the entrance to Oak Ridge Estates. A reporter, Madison Carter from Channel 5 News, stepped out, microphone in hand, eyes shining with the hunger of someone who smelled scandal. I walked out to meet her, leaning against my truck as she adjusted the mic. Mr. Calloway, she said, we received an anonymous tip about a protected research deer being illegally hunted by a member of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. Would you care to comment? I let out a slow whistle. You might want to grab a notepad, Madison. Because this story, it's just getting started. I walked her and her camera crew through everything. The tracking data. The conservation program. The laws Karen had so blatantly ignored. And, of course, the cherry on top, the Facebook post where she bragged about it. By the time we finished, Madison looked like Christmas had come early. This is huge, she said, shaking her head. A protected animal, an HOA president abusing power, and social media evidence. This story writes itself. Just make sure you spell my name right, I said with a smirk. Because Karen's about to learn what it feels like to be hunted. And sure enough, by noon, the story had gone live. Karen's smug face was plastered on every news site in town, right next to a photo of Willow in the wild, peaceful, innocent. The contrast was damning. The reaction was instant. Wildlife conservation groups got involved. Animal rights activists flooded her social media with outrage. Legal experts weighed in, pointing out every single law she had broken. Karen, of course, reacted exactly how I expected. She doubled down. She went live on Facebook, ranting about rural lunatics and media hysteria. She called me a liar, claimed I was harassing her, insisted she was the real victim. It was the worst possible move she could have made. Because the more she talked, the more people started digging. And then, the final bombshell dropped. The State Department of Wildlife Enforcement issued an official statement. They were launching a full investigation. Karen was spiraling, and she knew it. She thought she could control the narrative, like she always had. But this time, she had no control at all. By the time the State Department of Wildlife Enforcement announced their investigation, Karen Whitmore was drowning. She just didn't know how to stop flailing. Her face had been smeared across every news station in the county, her name attached to poaching, corruption, and abuse of power. Her once loyal HOA minions had gone radio silent, the same people who used to grovel at her feet now pretending they barely knew her. And yet, instead of lying low, instead of shutting up and hoping this would all blow over, she made it worse. The morning after the wildlife officials confirmed their investigation, I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, only to find the city inspector's truck parked outside my barn. I sighed before I even got close. The guy barely made eye contact as he shuffled through his clipboard, clearly just as uncomfortable as I was. "Morning, sir. We received an anonymous complaint regarding your property, possible zoning violations, illegal farming activities, and unauthorized animal enclosures. Gonna have to take a look around." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "Let me guess. Karen Whitmore." He winced, which told me everything I needed to know. "Look, I just do what I'm told," he muttered. I crossed my arms, nodding toward Oak Ridge Estates in the distance. "Tell me something. You ever had to investigate her for violations?" Silence. Because we both knew the answer. Karen had been weaponizing the HOA rules for years, bending them to her will, punishing people for things as small as painting their doors the wrong shade of beige. And now that her empire was collapsing, she thought she could turn the system against me. Too bad for her, I had nothing to hide. "Go ahead, knock yourself out," I said, stepping aside. "Just make sure to spell my name right on your report." The inspector sighed, rubbing his temples like he wished he'd called in sick. He walked around for 20 minutes, scribbled on his clipboard, and finally gave up. "Everything checks out," he admitted. "I'll file the report, but this was a waste of time." "Oh, I know," I said, smirking. He climbed back into his truck, leaving Karen's pathetic little revenge attempt in the dust. I didn't even bother getting mad. I had bigger things to focus on. The state investigation was moving faster than I expected. Karen had been asked to turn over any remains of Willow, but, predictably, she refused to cooperate. And that? That was a big mistake. By lunchtime, another bombshell hit. The HOA board, the same people who had spent years backing Karen, enforcing her ridiculous, soul-sucking rules, announced that she was being suspended as president, pending further review. It wasn't a full removal yet, but it was clear what they were doing. They were jumping ship. The same people who once defended her without question were now trying to pretend they had no idea who she was. Karen must have felt the walls closing in, because that afternoon, she made one final, desperate move. Not a public stunt this time. Not a Facebook rant or a fake legal threat. She tried to run. At 5:43 p.m., security footage caught Karen sneaking out of her house, tossing suitcases into the trunk of a rental car. She had cleared out her bank accounts, sold her SUV, and tried to flee the state. And the only reason she got caught? Her own damn HOA rules. She had been hiding out in a rental car, parked overnight in a lot near the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center, directly violating one of the very parking policies she had written herself. A security guard, seeing an unregistered vehicle sitting there after dark, reported it to local law enforcement. By 6:15 p.m., wildlife officials and police were waiting for her outside a gas station. By 6:30 p.m., she was in handcuffs. And by 6:45 p.m., I was watching the footage of her arrest from my truck, coffee in hand, shaking my head in pure satisfaction. Karen lost it. She screamed at the officers, at the news cameras, at anyone within earshot. "This is harassment," she shrieked. "I am the victim. I am being persecuted. This is a setup." But none of it mattered. The evidence was undeniable. Willow's GPS data, Karen's own Facebook confession, the remains buried in her backyard, her refusal to cooperate, she had nowhere to run. The last thing the news cameras caught was Karen being shoved into the back of a police car, her face red with rage. For years, she had ruled Oak Ridge Estates with an iron fist, crushing anyone who dared step out of line. And now, she was done. The fallout from Karen Whitmore's downfall was nothing short of spectacular. With her arrest making headlines, the HOA board scrambled to distance themselves from her, but it was too late. The community had turned against them. The very people who had once blindly followed Karen's rules were now demanding answers. Where had their HOA fees really been going? Why had they been fined for trivial things like mailbox colors while Karen had been embezzling funds for years? The truth unraveled faster than anyone expected. Investigators discovered financial discrepancies, missing funds, and shady real estate deals tied directly to Karen's personal accounts. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA, once her personal empire, collapsed under its own corruption. For the first time in over a decade, Oak Ridge Estates was free. No more absurd restrictions, no more fines for stepping an inch over the property line. Neighbors started repainting their homes in colors that weren't on the HOA-approved list, putting up mailboxes of all shapes and sizes, even hosting barbecues without worrying about receiving a noise complaint letter the next morning. The HOA, once feared, ceased to exist. And Karen? She lost everything. Her reputation, her house, her so-called legacy. She was charged with felony poaching, HOA fraud, and tax evasion, and when all was said and done, she had no allies left. Her once loyal HOA followers, the same people who had clung to her every word, were now pretending they never knew her. Her house, her prized possession, her throne, her fortress of power, was put up for sale. And no one wanted it. Except for me. I bought Karen's house at a fraction of its worth, and I turned it into something she would have hated with every fiber of her being. A wildlife education center. The very place where Karen had schemed against her neighbors and waged war against nature was now a sanctuary for the animals she despised. Kids came to learn about conservation, families walked the trails through the woods, and right in Karen's former front yard, where she had once scolded children for stepping on her precious grass, stood a bronze statue of Willow. A permanent reminder of what she had done, and how it had cost her everything. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, I sat on Karen's old porch, watching a group of kids marvel at a young fawn near the tree line. I let out a slow breath, taking in the peace of it all. No more HOA rules. No more Karen. Just the land, the animals, and the quiet justice of it all. It made me wonder, how many other people out there have dealt with a Karen like this? How many have had their lives turned upside down by someone drunk on power? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules or an overbearing neighbor? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.